my experiences are different than yours, and your experience is different than mine, and that's what we have then to contribute to each other, right? But they're just kind of really all stories. And so I find this interesting because when people say, well, I want you to share your story, and I'm like, well, it's kind of depressing. Why does anybody want to hear it? What I have realized is that most of the time the stories that we tell ourselves, we really define ourselves in a very negative way. We use the stories that happen to us and we either hide them and we don't tell people, or they're covered in shame, or we don't want to talk about them. We go, oh, I'm going to do that, but they still define us and how we think about ourselves, and we kind of carry them on. And so then you get to meet someone like me, and I'm like, I'll tell you all about my story. I'll tell you those dark chapters, the ones that I wish I could rip out of the book, right, that I wish weren't there. And people love to hear that. And why is that? I think it's because we love stories of people who are resilient. We love stories about people who've picked themselves back up, who've come out of a really dark chapter and have continued on. And I think part of the problem is that we don't normally show our transparency and our vulnerability, right? And I think it's getting worse because we have social media. And so nobody shows their transparency and their vulnerability because everybody is perfect, and we're having these kind of quiet coffee conversations with each other going, I know, it's like fake book, right? Like everything is so fake on it. And we say this to each other, right? And then everybody looks like an Instagram model, right? Everybody looks perfect, and it's because they have a filter, right? So any picture you see of me was probably filtered, okay? And I'll tell you, so a few years ago, I'm from Jersey. I lived out in Colorado for 10 years. I moved back to Jersey about 7 years ago. And a girlfriend of mine commented, one of my very, very good friends, like someone who should know me, commented on my Facebook post. She's like, oh, it looks like you're doing so great in Jersey and you're so happy. And I felt it was very important to call her and set the record straight. And I was like, you know what, I'm calling you just so you know, not only am I not happy and I am not doing well, I'm actually quite depressed. And I'm back in therapy. So just whatever you think you see on Facebook, you should feel bad for me. And it's because I had just come out of what I now can, like, I don't know if I can say lovingly, but I can at least smile and say it was my 5-year life crisis. So I come out of this 5-year life crisis and I moved back to Jersey. And so I don't know the story that you wrote yourself when you grew up. Okay, so this was the story that I wrote myself when I grew up. I grew up in North Jersey, had a normal, family, and I went to college and I graduated college after 3 years, which should make my story very impressive, right? Because when you do that, that means that your story is going to go on to be really great when you get like all these accolades and honors. And so I had gotten involved in direct sales while I was in college, and it's a really big direct sales company that you all know because I drove a pink Cadillac. Okay? And so I have this company, I'm driving a pink Cadillac. My story is I got married, and I was going to have 3.5 kids because I didn't want like 2, but I didn't want like a ton, so 3.5 was a good amount. And I was going to have this great story life. And so here I am, I'm living in Colorado, driving my pink Cadillac. I have a baby. She's just about, not quite 2. And I get invited by our company to speak at a regional event. And it was really cool because I was going to train the future leaders. So it wasn't just that I was speaking at the event, I was training the future leaders, right? So now I'm feeling like really good, right? This is like a good chapter in my story, right? And so I go and I come home and I'm like so excited and my career is going great. And over the next 24 hours, my entire life changes. My now ex-husband is arrested on a domestic violence assault against me. And over the next year, my entire life falls apart, like one at a time. And it is very Lifetime movie-like. So I find out that the person that I had been with for years actually was not real. And what do I mean by that? Like the school that I thought he went to that's in my wedding announcement doesn't exist, never went there. The job that I thought he had, multiple jobs, never existed. I found bank accounts because there was lots of drugs and alcohol that I did not know about. There were warrants out for his arrest that I did not know about. Turns out he was arrested for drugs while we were getting engaged, was actually serving in a deferment program while I was getting married, and his family helped hire an attorney to cover it up. So I didn't know. So can you imagine like everything that you thought you knew about your story all of a sudden is like, this is not my story. And turned in that pink Cadillac because I was being stalked. So I have this year of like the police on speed dial, we're on a friendly first name basis, and I'm getting thrown into the story that I never wanted to be in. And so it took about a year to finally get the ink signed. So if you've ever been divorced, you know that like just because your ink is signed does not mean you're out of court. So my court from start to finish was about 6 years. But after a year, I got at least my name back, right? And so I think, okay, this was not the chapter that I wanted to write, but I'm going to pick myself back up, right? I'm going to start writing a new chapter. And about 6 months later, my daughter is now 3 and a half. And I take her to the emergency room, and I think she has probably pneumonia. She's kind of like can't breathe. And we had been seeing doctors. She had been sick. So we get her to the emergency room, and we're in Colorado at this point, and they tell me that she does not have pneumonia. So that's a good thing. The bad thing is she probably has stage 4 cancer. And had I put her to sleep that night, she would have died in her sleep because her lungs were collapsing, and she was suffocating. That's why she was breathing funny. Now to top this all off, I'm in the emergency room, finding out that my daughter has cancer, and of course you have to notify the other parent, right? And so now my ex-husband's attorney is on the phone saying, well, he wants to come exercise his parenting time and we need the mother removed from the hospital. So then we have to go get like my restraining orders, my parenting time. And so I felt like over the next few years, like next year or so, the story, like the book that I was reading was like almost like a Johnny Depp movie, like really weird. Like Willy Wonka, Edward Scissorhands, where you're just like, this isn't quite reality, right? But this is like this world that I'm thrown into. And so my daughter had a lot. She had bone marrow transplant, chemo, radiation, the whole thing. And to save you from having to worry about the end of the story, she is 13 now. And she is my little miracle kid. Yeah, she's amazing. She's incredible. She's a survivor. And the way our story kind of turned out was that now, her dad lives in a different state, and we don't see him anymore, which unfortunately in this situation was a good thing. And she's doing really well and, has been a survivor. She'll actually go to the survivors clinic. We go to CHOP, so she'll go to the survivors clinic at the end of this month. And there are some other things. She's had, some autoimmune issues, and she wears hearing aids, but overall is doing really well, doing well in school. So this sounds like a really great story, right? And it's interesting because when I share, I'm very transparent. I tell people about the domestic violence. I tell people about my daughter's cancer. But what I find interesting is that it's what we tell ourselves about our story that really determines our ending. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I love words. I'm all about words. And so I looked up, well, what does story mean? So, and I was president of the Lion Club in high school, much to my dad's, was very proud about that. So the word story comes from the Latin word storia. And that actually comes from the initial Latin word, which it was shortened, which was historia. So it means like history. It's just an account, a tale of something that happened. And so it's something that's in the past that doesn't really like exist anymore. So our stories don't really exist anymore. And then what's really interesting is in the 1500s, it became a euphemism for lie. So like that's why I say, oh, she told me a story, right? So our stories, I wonder just like how many of us have these stories that we tell ourselves about our circumstances in our life that are really just lies that we tell ourselves, right? And we just are like the only ones who believe it, right? And so I could have a story now that, well, I'm a victim of domestic violence. And I'm the mom of a cancer kid, I see this a lot. These parents, their kids go through cancer, and it's like that is the story now for the rest of their life. It's just all about this cancer. And I'm a single mom. This has been a big one for me as a story. I realize there's a story about single moms. Single moms must be poor and they must struggle, right? And so, like, how often do we take that on as who we are? Because that's the story. We all know that, right? Oh, she's a single mom. She must be struggling. And then we kind of create that because that's what the story is. And so we give them like this meaning and this value. And then I think, but it's a story, so it's in the past. It's over. It's done with. It doesn't exist anymore. But I'm making it exist, right? And so I can keep that story. I can keep these stories of I'm a victim, this is what happened to me, this is what happened, and continue that. And I can, how many of us do this, right? Something bad happens in our life and we go, why me? Anybody ever thought that? Like, why me? And I very openly I thought that. Like, why me? But this is the answer that I have to that. Like, why not me? Like, why do I think that I am so special that I should get through life unscathed? So when somebody says, like, well, why me? I kind of feel like, well, that's really the wrong question because why not you? Maybe that's a millennial thing. I don't know. I think I'm so special that nothing bad should happen to me. But that's not true, right? Like somebody's going to have something horrible happen to them, so why should it not be you? And so there's stories that, you know, it can be a very dramatic story, like a circumstance that happened in your life, but it can also be stories that happened when we were in school. And I see this with coaching people, right? There's a story of, well, I was told I was lazy. I was told that I was ugly. I was told that I wasn't smart. I was told that I was fat. And so like we take these stories and we continue to tell ourselves these stories and they become true. So I was working with this woman and she told me very upfront, she said, well, I just need to let you know I'm not good with money. And I thought, well, that's like a really bold like proclamation, right? And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. I'm like, so tell me, you know, more about that. And so her story was that she was in high school and she really struggled with math. And I mean really struggled. Like they had the parents in at the school, there was meetings with the teacher, there was meetings with the principal, like she was really struggling. And so the teacher said to her, well, you're not good at math. And I thought this was interesting because I was like, well, another version could have been that the teacher wasn't good at teaching math. But nobody said that story. They told her she wasn't good at math. And so she took that then, and she thought, well, then I'm not good with numbers, right? And then that evolved in her story into, well, money is numbers, and I'm not good in math, and I'm not good with numbers, so I must not be good with money. And now as an adult, she truly believes she is not good with money and struggles with money because she had a teacher in math who told her she wasn't good at math. Like that is the power of how we can take these stories and run down this roller coaster with it, right? And we all do this. We have stories in our head about who we are, what other people think about us in business, about if we're successful or not, or if we're going to be good in business and success. And what's interesting is our stories can even be based in business, at least, based on our gender. So this is what studies show. If you're a man and you start a business and you fail, you are likely to say, well, that was a bad business. That business clearly was not a good business plan. It was a good business model. I need to go find a different business. That is the story that men will tell themselves. Women, on the other hand, when they start a business and they fail, they go, I'm not good at business. It must be me. I'm not successful. So literally the stories we tell ourselves can simply be based on our gender. Isn't that really interesting? Mm-hmm. All right. And we start our stories at like this super, super young age. So I found this with my daughter. My daughter's in elementary school. Now she's in middle school, but she's in elementary school. And she comes home one day and she tells me she's very upset because a kid at school said he didn't like her. Now, of course, as a mom, right, we're all like, oh, how could someone not love you? You're perfect. Okay, and she's like, he said he didn't like me. And I'm like, okay. So this is the story. He didn't like me. And I said, okay, so tell me what was happening. And I think they were on recess or they were at gym, whatever. And they're out on the field. And there's some boys there. And he says, I don't like her. And I said, okay, well, did he say, like, I don't like Emily? And she's like, well, no. But he said, I don't like her. So clearly, he was talking about her, right? And I said, okay, well, did he say, like, I don't like her and then, like, point and look at you? And she's like, no. And I said, like, well, did the other kids, like, kind of all in an agreement glance in your direction that there was something indicating that you were the her they were referring to? And she's like, no, but I know he was talking about me. And I'm like, okay, so is there any possibility that the story could be different? I was like, Em, were there any other girls on the field? And she's like, well, yeah. And I was like, so is it possible they were talking about somebody else? She's like, well, right? And I said, well, was the teacher a girl? And she's like, yeah. And I was like, so is it possible that maybe when he said I don't like her, he meant the teacher? She's like, well, maybe. And I was like, or maybe he was talking about his mom, or his babysitter, or his sister, or like a plethora of other people besides you, right? And so she had to reluctantly agree that potentially there was a different version of the story than the one that she had told herself. And now that she is 13, we use this technique over and over because middle school is a whole interesting experience, okay? And so what I think is that how we interpret these stories, like how we choose the narrative of the stories is what becomes our strength as people. All right, so I can tell myself, I'm a victim. That's my story. I was victimized by this person who lied for me to the moment that they met me. Or I can say to myself, well, there were some red flags. Like whether I knew them or not, looking back now, there were clearly red flags that I chose to ignore. And I chose to marry somebody, and there were some severe consequences to that. But some of those consequences are that I have my daughter. And some of those consequences are that I've realized how incredibly strong and brave I can be when I need to be. And some of those consequences are I've now had the chance to go to Trenton and testify and promote legislation in New Jersey for victims that I wouldn't have had if I didn't have that story. So that's a great ending to my story, right? And my daughter, I could say to her, well, Em, you are a cancer kid. You have a weak body. You have a weak immune system. Now we have to worry about late effects and long-term effects and all of that stuff. But I've chosen to give her a different story. So her story is that she's a miracle kid. That she does better than her doctors think she will do. And that she is brave and that she is powerful. And that when she went into kindergarten and she was so nervous because she had never been in preschool, and I was like, kiddo, these kids are still learning how to take their hands out of their pants. And you have kicked cancer. They're trying to not eat their boogers. You're good. You're gonna be good, right? That's her story, that if you could do that at 3, there's nothing that you can do. And that's the story that I want her to read about her life. So I wonder, if all of us right now think about our stories and start to write different endings to our stories. And we're going to talk about business because we're business here. So how do we write these stories different when it comes to business? So I'm going to give you some examples. You call a client, you call a customer, and they're really nasty and rude and hang up on you. Has anybody ever had that happen?
Really does happen all the time.
I'll tell you, Leanne has a story. You should listen to her. She's an inspiring woman to me. I've known her for 20 years, and what you did for your son and taking care of your son has always stayed in my heart. See, we all have a story. You need her to speak. So we can have a story in our head that they hate us, they hate real estate, that we're bad in sales, that we're not good on the phone. That could be our story. Or a possibility could be that as the phone was ringing, they were in the middle of fighting with their spouse, and they just picked up in the middle of an argument. That's a possibility, right? Or a possibility could be that they just hung up the phone with the school principal because little Johnny or little Susie just bit a kid at school. Right? That's a possibility. Or they could have just gotten a call from their doctor with some really bad news. We don't know what the story is, and we can choose what narrative we want to believe. Same thing if you go for a job. You go for a job, you have this great interview, my resume is tight, I'm good, I'm supposed to have the job, and then I don't get it. And I'm like, what happened? I'm a failure, I'm no good, I'm never going to get this promotion. Those are the stories we tell ourselves. Or is it possible that the person who interviewed you, you look like their ex who they hate? Possible, right? And they were like, I just can't stand looking at this person for the rest of my life. Right? It had nothing to do with you. Somebody quits who works for you, and we tell ourselves a story. How many of them? It's so hard to find good help. Maybe that person didn't like your culture because they were negative and you were positive and they were a bad apple, and a bad apple was going to spoil the bunch, and the universe just saved you. That could be the story. Or a deal falls through that you were like, this was it. This was the turning point for my career, but maybe that deal was going to be the biggest headache you ever had. Right? So we get to choose our story. So we're going to finish up. I'm going to teach you how to be a star in your life. Who wants to be the star of their story? Because I'm the star of the story. And I'll tell you, I have a story. My story is making cancer fun. My daughter's the star of the story. All right? The star of the story. So I just share that as a little self-plug, if you are interested. I'm going to teach you how to be a star. So people love this because it's so silly, but there's 4 words, S-T-A-R. Okay, so you're going to be a star. So the first thing is when you start to tell yourself a story and it goes down the roller coaster, you have to stop. That's the first thing we need to do is stop before that brain goes right? And the second thing we need to do is think. So we stop and we think. And our A is we have to become aware. Is it possible that there's a different ending to this story? Is it possible that there's a different version to the story? Is it possible that you look like the ex? Is it possible that it was the gym teacher? Is it possible that there's another story? And then if we can go, okay, it is possible that there's another version, then we can R, which is respond. Because what happens to most of us in life is we react to the circumstances and the stories and the things that are happening to us. And when we react, we give up all of our power to what's happening to the story around us. And all the characters around us, they get more power than we do. But when we stop and think and are aware there could be a different version, then we can respond. And when we respond, we take our control back. So for me, I chose to respond to cancer with fun. That was how I chose to respond. And so when we respond, all of a sudden, we, instead of reading our story, we become the author and we start writing our story. And that's where we find our power. So I appreciate you guys being here with me today. Thank you.